Have you ever realized that the person who saved you was standing beside you all along, quietly holding the pieces of your broken heart together, waiting for you to finally see them? This is a story about love that existed in silence, about a home that wasn't made of walls but of unwavering presence. If this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Now, let me tell you about Daniel and Emma. Daniel Hart was a man who believed he had everything figured out. At 32, he was a successful architect in Boston, designing buildings that touched the sky while his own foundation crumbled beneath him. He lived in a sleek downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, but he never really looked at the view. He was too busy running, always running, from something he couldn't name. Emma Chen had known Daniel since they were children. They grew up 3 houses apart in a quiet suburban neighborhood where kids still played outside until the streetlights came on. She remembered the exact moment she realized Daniel was special. They were 9 years old, sitting under her grandmother's weeping willow tree, and Daniel had looked at her with those serious brown eyes and said he was going to build houses for people who didn't have them. Even then, he was trying to fix the world's broken pieces because he didn't know how to fix his own. They went to different colleges but stayed in touch through late-night phone calls and texts that said everything and nothing at all. Emma became a pediatric nurse, drawn to healing in the most literal sense, while Daniel built his empire of glass and steel. She watched him date other women, fall in love, get his heart broken, and never once did she tell him that she had been in love with him since she was 16. Sitting in his beat-up car outside the movie theater, watching him laugh at something stupid on the radio. The night everything changed started like any other Friday. Daniel called Emma at 11 p.m., his voice thick with whiskey and something darker. His father had died 3 months ago, suddenly, a heart attack at 61, and Daniel had been spiraling ever since. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't cry afterward. He just worked more, drank more, smiled less. Emma was at his apartment within 20 minutes, using the spare key he'd given her years ago. She found him on the balcony, 30 floors up, staring down at the city lights like they held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The wind whipped his dark hair across his forehead, and when he turned to look at her, she saw something that terrified her. Not sadness, emptiness. She didn't say anything. She just walked over and stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. They stayed like that for an hour, maybe more, the city breathing below them, alive and indifferent to their small human pain. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He told her things he'd never told anyone, how his father used to hit his mother when Daniel was young, before the divorce, how Daniel had spent his whole life building beautiful things because his childhood home had been so ugly, how he was tired of pretending to be whole when he felt shattered inside. Emma listened the way she always had, with her whole heart, and when he was done, she took his hand. His fingers were cold, and she wrapped both of her hands around his, trying to warm them. That's when Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he'd been too blind to see before. She had always been there. Every breakup, every success, every 3 a.m. panic attack about his future. Emma had been the constant in his chaotic life, the still point in his turning world. But he was broken, and he knew it. So instead of pulling her close, he pulled away. He thanked her for coming, his voice formal, distant, and she understood the dismissal. She left, and Daniel stood alone on that balcony until dawn, wondering why the emptiness felt even deeper now. The weeks that followed were hard. Daniel threw himself into a major project, a community center in a struggling neighborhood, working 16-hour days to avoid thinking about anything real. Emma gave him space, but she worried. She could see him disappearing into himself, becoming a ghost in his own life. She wanted to shake him, to tell him that running wouldn't save him, but she knew he had to find his way back on his own. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Emma was at work when Daniel's assistant called. Daniel had collapsed at a construction site, exhaustion, dehydration, his body simply giving out from months of neglect. Emma's heart stopped. She was at the hospital before the ambulance arrived, using every connection she had to make sure he got the best care. When Daniel woke up, groggy and disoriented, the first face he saw was Emma's. She looked exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, dark circles under her eyes, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She was crying, trying not to, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, and Daniel realized with stunning clarity that he was an idiot. He tried to sit up and she immediately moved to help him, adjusting his pillows, checking his fore, slipping into nurse mode because that was easier than facing her emotions. Daniel caught her hand and she froze. He pulled her closer, ignoring the protest of his tired body, until she was sitting on the edge of his bed, their faces inches apart. He told her he was sorry. Sorry for being blind, for taking her for granted, for not seeing that the home he'd been searching for his entire life had been right beside him all along. He told her that she was his foundation, his constant, the only thing that had ever made sense in his messy, complicated life. He told her he loved her, that he had probably loved her for years but was too scared and stupid to recognize it. Emma cried harder then, but she was smiling through her tears. She told him she'd been waiting for him to figure it out, that she would have waited forever if that's what it took. She told him that love wasn't about perfect timing or having everything together. It was about showing up, about being present, about choosing each other even when it was hard. Daniel pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt like he could breathe. She fit against him perfectly, like she'd always belonged there, and he realized she had. All this time, while he was building homes for other people, Emma had been building one for him, brick by brick, moment by moment, with her patience and her presence and her unwavering faith in who he could become. The road to healing wasn't instant or easy. Daniel started therapy, finally dealing with the trauma he'd carried since childhood. He cut back his hours at work, started taking care of himself, learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness but courage. Emma stood beside him through all of it, not as his savior but as his partner. She challenged him when he fell into old patterns, celebrated his victories, held him through the hard days. 6 months later, Daniel designed something he'd never designed before, a home for himself and Emma. Not a showpiece, not something for magazines or awards, but a real home with a big kitchen for the dinners they'd cook together, a sunroom where Emma could read, a studio where Daniel could sketch. It was smaller than his downtown apartment, in a neighborhood with actual trees and neighbors who said hello, and it was perfect. The day they moved in, Daniel stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, and Emma came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. He turned in her embrace, cupping her face in his hands, looking at her with all the love he should have shown her years ago. He told her thank you. Thank you for waiting, for believing, for being his home when he had nowhere else to go. Emma smiled, that beautiful smile that had been lighting up his life since they were kids, and told him he'd always been home to her too. Home wasn't a place. It was them, together, finally seeing what had always been true. Daniel kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. And somewhere in that moment, the broken pieces he'd carried for so long began to feel like they might actually be healing. Because that's what love does. It doesn't erase the pain or fix everything instantly, but it gives you a reason to keep trying, a soft place to land when the world gets too heavy, a hand to hold in the darkness. They built a life together in that house, filling it with laughter and arguments and ordinary moments that felt extraordinary, because they were shared. Daniel learned that home wasn't something you constructed with blueprints and materials. It was something you found in another person's eyes, in the way they knew your coffee order, in how they could make you laugh when you wanted to cry. Home was Emma, and she had been all along. Years later, when people asked Daniel when he knew Emma was the one, he would always say the same thing. He'd known it long before he was ready to admit it, long before that night on the balcony or the hospital room or any single moment. She had been quietly becoming his home from the very beginning, and he'd been too busy looking everywhere else to notice what was right in front of him. The truth is, sometimes we spend our whole lives searching for something we already have. We look for home in success, in achievements, in new cities and new faces, never realizing that home might be the friend who's been answering our 3 a.m. phone calls for 15 years. Home might be the person who sees all our broken pieces and loves us not despite them, but because they make us who we are. Daniel and Emma's story reminds us that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks and grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet and patient, waiting in the wings while we figure ourselves out. It's the person who shows up consistently, who believes in us when we can't believe in ourselves, who builds us a home in their heart and waits for us to finally walk through the door. So if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone who's been your home all along, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to tell the people who feel like home how much they mean to you. Because life is short, and we shouldn't wait until we're falling apart to recognize the hands that have been holding us together all along. The greatest love stories aren't always about finding someone new. Sometimes they're about finally seeing someone who's been there all along.